So, I guess no one knows how to make a video on this particular topic outside of just giving you a Mohg tutorial for 5 minutes and then telling you that's where you access the DLC. So that means, once again, it's time for— I already sound full of myself. I sound so up my own ass. It took me like 15 seconds. That has to be a record. Alright, so respectfully, I think some people have made some videos that try their best to share an adequate means of preparation for the DLC, but fall short in terms of flexibility or just share details and strategies that I personally disagree with. So I figured sharing my own strategy might give people some new ideas or a fresh perspective on how to actually prepare for such a thing. I'm ready for my 18 inches of mesmer, and I know you are too, so let's talk save files. Most guides on YouTube will tell you to do a fresh save on a New Game Plus 0 because they're afraid of New Game Plus scaling accumulating in a way that makes the DLC content absurdly difficult. This is a 100% warranted and valid fear to have, but this also prevents you from trying out any new weapons and equipment as soon as you get them, since being on Journey 1 likely means your stats are going to limit what equipment you can and can't use. New Game Plus saves, however, do run the risk of being overly difficult, especially considering this is brand new content with new enemies and challenges the player just won't know how to respond to on a first experience. Okay, so I have a bit of a weird solution to this that I can guarantee no one else has told you. Prepare 2 saves. A fresh New Game save for the base experience, and a Journey 3 save, or New Game Plus 2 save, for the sake of trying all the weapons and equipment. Journeys 2 and 3 are considered significantly easier than the first because it takes so long for the damage modifiers to properly take effect, but everything eventually tapers out the closer you get to endgame content anyway, so this shouldn't matter too much. Play through the DLC on your fresh save first. This means you'll be approximately level 120 to 130 and make a commitment to stick to whatever weapons and equipment already fit your build. We're gonna call this your playing as intended save. Meanwhile, make a mental note or open a Google Doc or maintain a spreadsheet or some shit of any cool equipment you want to try out on your +2 save, where your character is ideally a much higher level and will be able to try out all the new stuff with a larger degree of freedom. We're gonna call this your fuck around save. You fuck around, everyone else finds out. There's also a necessary list of pickups and key items you will need for both saves to make upgrading, spirit tuning, and just general progression less of a headache. The most important of these items are going to be the bell bearings that unlock smithing stones, which will allow you to take the entire weapon upgrading system and just slap a Disney fast pass right on that shit. Grab the standard smithing stone bell bearings from the Crystallion in the Rhea Lucaria tunnel, the chest inside the Seal tunnel in Altus, the chest in the Zaymor ruins, and the Godskin duo. Standard smithing stone bell bearings 1 through 4 in that order. Grab the somber stone bell bearings from the Falling Star Beast in the Celia Crystal tunnel in Caelid, the Crystallion duo boss in the Altus tunnel, the First Church of Marika, the Tempest facing balcony in Farum Azula, and finally near the Great Bridge, also in Farum Azula. You just take the lift down and it's in the area with the water and a bunch of— you know the area I'm talking about. As far as spirit tuning is concerned, I honestly don't think it's a bad idea to at least consider going into Shadow of the Erdtree with a +9 or even a +8 or +7 summon on your person. This is if you don't like to play with summons. I don't like playing with summons. I think the only time I've ever even faced a boss with a summon is when something I'm talking about in a script directly necessitates that specific footage. Even still, this is what I'll probably do for the first couple attempts on a huge legacy boss, just because I think this will end up making the learning curve of some of Elden Ring's trump card bosses a little less exhausting. And when you're ready to face the boss for real, you can just forego the spirit summon entirely. He's a meat shield, basically, is what you're using him as. Regardless, if that's something you're thinking about doing, you'll need to take care of the boss in Wyndham Catacombs for the first Glovewort bell bearing, the Giant's Mountaintop Catacombs for the second, and by a lake in Farum Azula for the third. Just don't even fight anything, just get the bell bearing and just grace your way out of there. Just don't even fight anything. The Ghost Glovewort bell bearings can be picked up in Nokron by this gazebo here, the second bell bearing in a chest in Upper Noctstella, and the third all the way in motherfucking Elfile. Okay, if you don't care about summons, I would honestly recommend just skipping out on this one, just because it's so out of the way, and just focus on leveling spirits that take the regular old boring ass Gloveworts instead. Defeating Mohg is going to be a mandatory assignment, obviously, but a piece of info a lot of people are completely missing is that it's also necessary to defeat Radahn and unlock the upper Nokron area. No one really knows why, or if it's related to the massive skeleton of King Shit hanging out near the center of Nokron, but it probably is, or whatever. My dumbass wanted to be different and say the DLC would be accessed in St. Trina's hideaway in Altus, and that shit was wrong, so maybe I have no business making predictions. But a $40 DLC probably has way more content than just 18 inches of Mesmer, and since we recently learned defeating Radahn is necessary, this may also mean an extension on the lore of the Eternal Cities. As for the Kid Diddler himself, if your character can take him down, then it'll be ready for the DLC. It's just pretty clear cut there. Mohg's damage weaknesses are pretty straightforward. 10% negation against all physical types, 40% negation against magic, lightning, and holy, and 80% against fire. His status weaknesses is most notably blood loss, but frostbite, poison, and scarlet rot can also do some pretty heavy work. I'm saying all this because the immediate reflex for a lot of players is to use a bleed-heavy weapon, but if that weapon also does fire damage, like Morgoth's Cursed Sword or Eleonora's Pole Blade, or is fire-infused, that shit's gonna be as useless as deep-sea fishing with a super soaker. For bleed weapons, consider physical somber weapons like the Reduvia or Bloody Helus, or standard weapons with lots of fast attacks like Raptor Talons or the Petal Whip. For poison builds, you can use a poison-infused Ujigatana or Nagakiba with Poison Mothflight as the Ash. Weapons with innate bleed, when poison-infused, will include both poison and bleed status, both of which Mohg is weak to. As for protection and defense, you'll obviously want to have the Purifying tier, so go and kick Eleonora's ass for that shit, but you'll also need armor with high fire negation and robustness to mitigate his blood flame attacks. Consider heavier armor sets like the Tree Sentinel, Fire Prelate, and Banished Knight sets, but if you aren't Sigma enough for a real man's set of armor, some medium sets like the Zaymor and Fire Monk sets also have decent fire negation and robustness. Medium shields like the Brass and Banished Knight shields both offer great fire negation, and even small shields like the Smoldering and Man Serpent shields are also great choices. I promise I won't turn this entire section into a building tutorial since there are libraries worth of knowledge on YouTube already, and you could probably ask someone on a random Discord server and still get a pretty decent answer. But if you're an experienced enough Elden Ring player, then you could easily not even be level 100 for this. Like, if you can kill Mohg, you're gonna be ready for whatever the DLC throws at you. That's your benchmark. Alright, let's talk about level scaling. We don't have a shitting clue what the exact scaling is until the DLC is in our hands and mod utilities are updated accordingly. But until then, we can use information from past Souls games to draw an educated conclusion on what those scalings might be. My go-to example for this is probably going to be Dark Souls 3 because it has two finely aged DLCs to take info from, and in terms of gameplay and progression, I can imagine Dark Souls 3 gives us the closest parallel and therefore is the safest game to compare. Okay, so there's a very specific way FromSoft scales all of its enemies. Each enemy, boss, and living organism that wants to kill you, I guess, has a flat, unchanging amount of health, FP, stamina, and since this is Elden Ring, we can go ahead and throw stance HP in there as well. Basic enemies like exile soldiers and standard dudes have a little over 100 HP, beefier enemies like banished knights usually have around 500, and big bosses like Morgoth and Melania usually have HP levels around the mid-2000s. The reason we never see this is because each area of the game has its own scaling multipliers, starting at the Stranded Graveyard, which is just a multiplier of 1, all the way to Elphael, which is a hefty 7.328. Attack power, defense, and a bunch of other things are also controlled by these multipliers. Alright, so now that we know how that works, let's head on over to Dark Souls 3, where everything is handled roughly in the same way. The Fireless Shrine, the final area in the base game, has an HP multiplier of 4.52, rounded up. This is the highest HP multiplier in the base game, the second highest being Archdragon Peak with around 4.46, and the third highest being the Grand Archives with an even 4.4. However, things get a little complicated when you venture outside of HP multipliers. There's another section of this param that determines attack power scaling. Archdragon Peak is the highest in this regard, followed by Grand Archives, and then the Fireless Shrine as the third highest. This was weird finding this out because I always assumed that these multipliers were kind of fixed and stayed relatively the same distance apart from each other no matter what I was looking at, and it wasn't until right now as I'm researching for this video when I realized these weird little discrepancies are actually pretty normal. And the reason I think that's so important is because Ariandel, the game's first DLC, has an HP multiplier of 4.46, which only competes with the second highest scaling, and an attack power multiplier that matches the Archdragon Peak without going above it, like it's the exact same amount. Things only start getting oppressive when you head into into the ringed city, as the HP multipliers easily climb above 5, and the attack power multipliers are a good couple decimal points above Archdragon Peak, while still just barely climbing above the 2.5 mark. This leads me to the conclusion that yes, whatever waits for us in Shadow of the Erdtree is going to be harder, but not by some terrifyingly significant margin. If anything, if these numbers are indicative of where the scaling is headed, I'm less concerned about things hitting harder and more concerned about everything becoming way too tanky as you head into New Game Plus iterations, especially since that's become such a recurring problem in the past. The highest scaling we ever see in Elden Ring's base content is Millennia's scaling, which is an HP multiplier of 7.4 and an attack multiplier of 3.79. And if I had to tie like an exact prediction to it, I honestly can't see anything being thrown at us that isn't over an HP multiplier of 9 and an attack multiplier of 4.5. Anything above that I think would just be too overwhelming. I know I kind of fumbled the ball with the whole you don't start the DLC at Miquella's Egg scandal, whatever the shit that was, but this is math, okay? And nobody fucks with me when it comes to math. I unfortunately didn't get the chance to fly over to LA and experience the game for myself, and venturing outside of my house is already enough of a chore that I probably wouldn't have gone even if I was invited, but I'm sure you've already seen plenty of videos circulating, mainly showing a 13-minute roll of footage that everyone is using in their videos. Everyone who actually got to play the game wasn't allowed to record their own footage, but they did get to experience parts of the DLC that are just plain not shown in that press-approved B-roll, which means there's a non-zero chance that more established creators out there might watch this next part and just silently laugh to themselves without actually commenting on anything and saying that I'm wrong, and I think that shit's hilarious. But I'm gonna throw around some speculation on what I think the first area will contain, based on how Bandai themselves prepared their players at this event. According to Iron Pineapple, your play session began with 3 separate and equally leveled characters you could choose from. These characters were a warrior, a mage, and a knight, which he says ended up being a dex-focused character. The 3-player archetypes for this play session respectively revolve around strength, intelligence, and dexterity. This is important knowledge to have because if we continue sourcing from the same video, one of the first field bosses he encounters is this guy. I just want to take a minute to point this out. Anyone who played the game has to know the name of this particular boss, but I guess Bandai was secretive to the point of not even wanting people to divulge the names of the bosses themselves, so this video literally just has a section called Big Fire Guy. So, Big Fire Guy has a very obvious elemental focus that has nothing to do with any of the 3 archetypes we mentioned before. Fire incantations in Elden Ring are usually relegated to the faith stat, and since I'm a guessing man, I'd imagine this guy has a bit of holy resistance too, since this would fall in line with the fire giant defenses. He voiced a bit of trouble taking him down, and this boss definitely seems like the kind of boss that would hard counter any sort of dex build or characters lacking in the stance break department. But because of how Elden Ring has handled encounters like these in the base game, it is a pretty safe bet in my opinion that a lot of newer bosses might require certain gimmicks or strategies and playstyles that allow you to hard counter whatever it brings to the table. There's also been plenty of coverage regarding the new weapon types such as reverse grip swords, dueling shields, and an alarmingly high frequency of throwable weapons like spears and daggers that aren't tied to a finite quantity. This ultimately tells me that even though you may have to grind to be able to use some of the more grandiose weapons, I don't think the DLC wants trying out new equipment to be a chore. New weapon types, especially larger ones, are bound to have plenty of standard, low spectacle weapons as a part of their selection, because they want you to find your new favorite weapon type and commit to it as early as possible. And I just can't imagine those weapons having particularly high stat benchmarks or anything like that. I think Bandai wanted to specifically give people 3 different classes to choose from, not as some limit to the equipment they could test out, but as a means of progressing through different areas of the DLC. Maybe there's a magic-centric boss none of us are seeing somewhere in the DLC that mage characters would have a hard time getting past, but also an area with plenty of enemies weak to magic that would allow mage characters to explore pretty easily. As you could have guessed, I don't have an outro. I never do, but I'm just gonna be real for a second here. This channel has probably been in the greatest shape it's ever been, and I've never felt more thankful for the position I'm in. I don't know, it's just weird that hundreds of thousands of people just find enjoyment in having the circuitous ramblings of a screwball that likes math playing in the background while they do something that I'm sure actually benefits society. I'm looking forward to the DLC, obviously, but I'm also just looking forward to more of this, if I'm being honest. Oh, and go subscribe to my editor and donate to him or something. He fucking deserves it. Alright, see ya.